All right, thank you all for coming. I know this talk is very early in the term, so it didn't get advertised quite as far in advance as many of these do, but appreciate that you're here. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chad Mueller. He was born and raised on a diversified farm operation in Nebraska. He received his BS degree in animal sciences from Oklahoma State University and an MS and PhD in animal sciences from South Dakota State University. His graduate degrees focused on ruminant nutrition and beef cattle management, and over the past 19 years, Dr. Mueller's academic career has focused on research and teaching in various areas of applied agriculture management. He has developed and taught courses in a variety of subject matters related to animal and cropping agriculture systems management, agricultural sustainability, animal nutrition, global agricultural markets, and leadership development. He was hired by EOU in 2021 to develop, market, and launch the Agricultural Entrepreneurship degree program in the College of Business. Please welcome Dr. Mueller.
Thank you, Steve. Can everybody hear me okay? The lapel pin lapel mic wasn't working, so you get the mic for me. So Steve had asked me right before Christmas if I'd be willing to fill in the spot, and I said sure, even though I think the next day I was leaving for the Midwest, and then I got back last week, and so been trying to get this together, and hopefully all of it makes sense for folks. In the world of agriculture right now, we're seeing a tremendous amount of change. In fact, there's been reports out now that the ag economy itself is actually starting to reflect itself back in the late 70s and 80s. And during that point in time, we actually lost a third of all of our family farm operations out of the United States. And so what they're seeing is with inflation, with the global markets, with the competition at the commodity level, that it's tougher and tougher for operations, especially small and medium-sized operations, to actually be able to survive agriculture. And so what I want to do today is, as we talk a little bit about this, we have a lot of really cool technologies that are coming through, and there's a lot of push for how do we use these technologies to improve management, especially in agriculture and natural resource management. And so as part of that was, even though I'm going to focus a little more on the digital literacy aspect, artificial intelligence is one of those areas where we're seeing a lot of uptick, especially in the field of agriculture. And so what I want to do is just real quick give you a little overview of kind of the current status of agriculture and why, especially from the economic standpoint, why we're seeing this huge push for innovation and this need for innovation at the small and medium size agricultural entities, because those are essentially the ones we're losing. The large operations are growing, and basically as the small and medium size fall out, they're just gobbling up more land, taking more of that aspect over. And so I just kind of want to cover a few of those things, and then kind of end up with, show you where I'm going with really with my research program as we start to pick that up. So there's no research data in here that I've collected, but we're setting it up for as we move forward. So give you a quick outlook on agriculture itself. So since World War II, through a variety of things, through a variety of innovations, World War II actually brought a ton of innovations, especially the aspect of synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer really changed up the cropping side of things. Since then, we started to see tremendous inputs in regards to genetic selection. And so our production output has continually increased since World War II for every unit of input. And essentially, we have tripled the amount of output we are generating per unit of input in agriculture in the United States, which is pretty phenomenal. And there's a lot of people that say, well, is U.S. agriculture sustainable? Well, when you look at graphs like this, we are doing a lot more with a lot less. And so because of that, these technologies, we're hoping to actually push this line even further because we have less people in agriculture. We're actually losing more land now out of agriculture, out of production agriculture. And so we're actually having to take more marginal land and improve the production output. If you've been around Boise lately, there's an awful lot of high-value land that has actually now been covered up. And so now they're having to push out further, which is less fertile land, and they're trying to increase production. So these technologies become pretty important to actually improve that sustainability. If we look at just land in the United States itself, ag land makes up less than half of all the land that we use in the United States. Cropland, so if we're talking about any of the crops, and this would include commodity crops, cash crops, vegetables, we call them specialty crops, which would be fruits, vegetables, nut trees, those type of things. They're this small portion down here, and it's actually decreasing, and it's been decreasing now for about 20 years because it tends to be what I tell folks is if you can find a valley, that tends to be your most fertile land. And if you're a land developer, the last thing you want to do is put a lot of money in developing land, so flat land is actually easier to develop. And so the cost of that land is actually pushing out agriculture, and it's moving to more other entities. So on the cropping side, we're losing some of that out. On the grazing livestock side, we still have a fair amount. But again, with some policies that are coming through, forest management, rangeland management, some of those things can change. So we're trying to produce more, and the land, we're not capturing any more land. We're actually losing it as we push forward. So I broke this first part out as from the aspect of what really drives all this is the economics. So what's driving revenue and what are the expenses? And so if we look at the actual value of products that are generated, and these are just across all livestock and crops that are sold in the United States, over time, this goes back to 1992, that we've seen an upward trend. But for the most part, that trend has not kept up with expenses. In fact, the dairy industry, most people, does anyone here, just out of curiosity, have family members that were part of a dairy industry or still are? So Jill does. So the dairy industry right now, we're on the verge of actually losing the U.S. dairy industry. We are hemorrhaging about 100 dairy farms a month out of the United States. Over the last, I think the numbers I saw over the last 7 to 8 years, the average production cost to make 100 pounds of milk was roughly $20, and the average value returned was only $15. So over the last 7 to 8 years, most dairies have been losing at least $5 for every 100 pounds of milk that they produced. And Wisconsin, which was one of the largest dairy states in the country, has lost now up to 50% of their dairy operations in the last 10 years. And they don't see it slowing down. So it's really hard. So that gets back to what do we do? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Just so everyone knows, there are only 4 dairies left in Eastern Oregon. So from the Cascades all the way to Idaho line, there's only 4 dairies. And pretty much all of those are around Ontario or Vail. We actually do, I don't know, just a little FYI, we actually have the largest goat dairy operation on the West Coast, just right over here in Union. So Stephanie Rovey and her husband operate a dairy goat. If you want to see a really cool dairy goat operation, that's not too bad. Plus, goats are a lot easier to pick up than cows, so that's another nice thing about it. But anyway, we have seen an upward trend in the prices, and a lot of this at the end, the last couple years, has really been government support. It's COVID dollars. There was an awful lot of COVID dollars put into agriculture because there was a lot of processing systems that were shut down. The pork processing industry shut down for about 3 weeks. The backup was 18 months. And so because of that, there was a lot of money put into it. And so we actually are predicting this number to drop substantially because we're going to lose a lot of those support dollars that are going into the system. If we look at how the actual dollar, so I always tell my students, if you go all the way down to production, there's no way to pass on the costs. At some point in time, you hit the end. And so at the production level is really where they have to absorb any type of added costs that are further up the chain. So if Cisco Foods wants to add a transportation cost, they pass it on to their wholesalers or down to the processors, but eventually it ends up down at the production level. Right now, for every dollar that the consumer puts into food consumption or puts into food purchases, only about 9 cents makes it to the production level. And I always tell folks that you can't have agriculture without production, but production isn't all of agriculture. That all of these others are part of agriculture as well, but they keep grabbing bigger and bigger dollars. Food services is actually number one, takes almost a third of the total dollar. And as labor costs keep going up, that chunk of that dollar is going to continue to increase, and less is going to actually be passed down. So when we start talking about things like technology, the reason I like to bring this up is if we can find ways to actually reduce our expenses or improve the utilization of those inputs, then we can actually make that 9 cents go further on those production levels. And so that's why I included a lot of these, not to just, since I have two econ folks in here, not to just appease them. Doug. Food services, so in this case, anything that's dealing with taking a packaged food and preparing it for you. And so restaurants, fast food chains, which can also include kind of an additional processing phase to get to that point of food service. So it's pretty much that customer-facing aspect of giving a prepared food product. So it's no longer raw product, it's been processed, it's ready to be served to the customer. So food service, it's a big area, and there's a lot into it. But so like if you were looking at something like Reeser Foods or Cisco Foods, they would fall more into this aspect of food processing and transportation and wholesale, because they're getting it to those folks that are at the front lines that are actually putting it out there. Does that make sense? No, that is at this level of retail trade. So because that is not a prepared, so food services is actually the food's actually being prepared and being served type of deal. So the other thing about this is, and I was telling my students this morning about this because I was listening to the news and people were really starting to, again, throw their arms up because eggs were now getting closer to $4 a dozen. And it's like, that is really cheap, folks. When you start looking at these things, and so the U.S. customer, the consumer that's given the dollar, doesn't want to give any more of that dollar. And so because of that, that's why we have to get more efficient further down the line. And so I tell folks is people get up in arms when we charge $3.50 for a gallon of milk. And yet when you actually price out the cost of a bottle of water, it's actually a lot of times higher than that. And there's no other nutritional value to it. And so because of that, the consumer itself, this number itself, just under 13% of disposable income goes to food. In the United States, it's much higher in other countries, and of course that will vary depending on which income demographic you are, but only about 13%. So I always tell my students we like our houses and we like our vehicles, and that's where most of our disposable income goes. And so because of that, that dollar, this dollar that we have to fund everything else, the general consuming public doesn't want to give any more of those dollars because more of those dollars want to go to other things and not just food because we've been used to having cheap food. So that kind of creates a little bit of a quandary from the consumer behavior standpoint. If we look at income, one of the things that it always kind of bothers me a little bit, I'll hear USDA actually announce to the general public, U.S. farm receipts are the highest we've seen in 60 years. And everyone's like, see, agriculture is making a lot of money. But what they don't talk about is, one, they say gross income, and that's it. And the reality is, if you look at the expense line, which is this one, it pretty much mirrors those changes in income. So the reality is, over the last 30 years, 40 years, what we've seen is, even though if we see an increase in that income at the farm level, roughly 80 to 85% of it is being gobbled up by expenses. So we haven't seen this where those gaps have opened up to where we actually see more actual income coming in. And so if we look at agriculture, and this is just 20 years, it's pretty much been flatlined that whole time. Where at this point in time here was actually COVID dollars. And you're seeing it starting to come back down. Peter. Oh.
We can do questions in the middle if that's okay with you.
Sure, sure.
So.
When income goes up, I usually see, or when expenses go, is it going on?
There you go.
When expenses go up, doesn't income usually go down?
It does, but pretty much what we're seeing is on these is they're so even though we see sales and the value of those sales, maybe it's cattle, maybe it's corn, maybe it's cotton, whatever, going up, they seem to see expenses because of contracts that are almost happen the same time. So we don't see that separation. And that's why we don't see a big change in income, because we don't see this big lag. So when grain input was cheap for on the livestock side, typically what would happen is fuel costs were going up. Other costs were going up, offsetting those. And over the last 20 years, that's the thing. When we've seen something where an expense got cheaper, another expense seemed to kind of wash it out. And so because of that, we haven't seen a change in that overall income. So because of this, it's really hard, and so this is where I tell folks, it's really hard for people in production agriculture to pay for insurance, to be able to send their kids to college, to actually be able to do those things that a lot of other folks kind of take for granted. And so I know an awful lot of farming operations, they don't have insurance. And unfortunately, sometimes it just takes one accident and it wipes everything out. And so this idea of how can we make these a little more efficient, and basically where can we grab some efficiency and reduce that overall input expenses? How can we better utilize some of those expenses? And that's where some of this technology is hopefully coming in. And so a couple of these I'll just go through here pretty quick. Again, since 1970, you can see this is just expenses, production expenses itself, either nominal or inflation adjusted, but they're increasing. And we haven't seen that change at all. And in fact, it's ramping up in several ways. If you want to know what's really costing us, so how this graph is, these are the big expenses. The second one here is the actual, in this case would be the actual animals, so the price of them. But if we look at inputs, so if we're doing livestock, feed has not only been the number one expense for livestock, but it's also been increasing over the last 4 to 5 years. All right, so labor, whoops, go back. Labor, this is a big one. In fact, we live in a state where we have some of the highest ag labor costs because of our overtime laws that have come in. Washington has so far beaten us out in that regards because they haven't laxed any of the overtime laws. And actually Washington right now, they're actually to the point where they're cutting their organic programs because the organic farms are leaving the state because they can't afford the labor for organic production anymore. So they're going to other states. And so the West Coast, because of our overtime laws, that's adding that level. And so I can tell you right now in the state of Oregon, labor is the number 2 expense for all of agriculture. And it has jumped up dramatically. It wasn't even on the radar. It wasn't even a top 5 expense about 5 years ago, and now it's the number 2 expense, and it's increasing. So when we start talking technologies, that becomes deal. How do we offset the labor? How do we change up how we better use the labor? Farm services, all these. So farm services, this is a unique one. So as we get more into artificial intelligence, as we get into more precision ag, and what we're calling it now is climate smart ag systems. So the current farm bill, which actually died for the first time since 1943, was actually rejuvenated with the last go of the federal government when they passed the very last day to get the funding. They also put a provision in there to extend the farm bill for 1 more year. Otherwise, it would have been the first time since 1943 that Congress would have failed to actually pass one. And part of that is what they call climate smart ag, which is CSA ag, which is getting more into this farm services. So how do we deal with GPS technology, especially proprietary technology that individual producers actually can't service, that they actually have to go through the companies? And that's where you see these, what is it? The right to fix bills. Oregon actually passed the right to repair laws that are coming through will actually help with driving down some of those costs. But again, all of these are coming across. They're getting more and more. I can tell you right now, this aspect of tractors and equipment, I got my oldest brother is actually in the equipment side of things. Equipment sales have died off dramatically, but there are tractors now that you're easily paying $750,000 to $1.2 million just for the tractor. And I'm going to show you some equipment that's it's getting outrageous. Sprayer operations that are 1.2 to 1.5 million for one piece of equipment. And you're trying to pay those things off. So there's a lot of money, great technology, but there's a cost that's coming with it. So this is a couple other real quick ones I wanted to cover, because I also know that Penn State and Notre Dame are playing, so I know that kicks off in 10 minutes, so I'll make sure I get through this. Is the aspect of land sale. So agriculture is natural resource intensive. Even if we're renting, leasing land, or buying land, land has increased dramatically. If we look at, and this is in the U.S. from 1950 to this is roughly 2022, the price is now roughly across the United States is a little over $4,000. Where I come from in southeast Nebraska, it is not irrigated. It's not part of the irrigated part of Nebraska. At one point in time, about 6 years ago, land prices were going up $500 per acre every 6 months. And so if you didn't buy right away and you waited a year, you were paying another $1,000 an acre. To give you some comparison, what's happening around here is the Church of Latter-day Saints is one of the biggest landowners around here, and they're buying up tons of agricultural land. In fact, if you go over to, Interstate 82 that takes you up to Tri-Cities, so on the left side and go all the way up to the Tri-Cities, that is all owned by the Church of Latter-day Saints. They paid $35,000 an acre for that, and their only other outbidder was Bill Gates, and Bill Gates dropped out at $30,000. And basically that's what they're paying, because they actually have to spend that money. So they're buying, in fact, I know they're in the Baker Valley buying a bunch of land. They've bought a bunch out of Ontario, and a lot of it is all production acre. They are not renting that out. And so because of that, it's driving up land prices tremendously. And so as we start to see these things, agriculture becomes even tougher to do. So I put on here implications of land ownership on management systems. We talk about sustainability, but sustainability tend to be long-term practices. If I'm leasing land, they want a return on their investment. And a lot of times they're saying, we'll give you a lease, but it's 3 years or 5 years at the most. And if you want to put in, quote, sustainability practices, improve soil conditions, that takes time. And you're not going to put that effort in if in 5 years, maybe it takes you 10 years to get there, but in 5 years you lose it, you've lost all your investment. Okay, so this change of land ownership has a huge implication on how we manage these land areas. Labor is definitely an issue, and there's a lot of things in agriculture. Labor is one of those. It's always been a labor-intensive industry. All the natural resources have, but it's also been, where do we get that source of labor? At one point in time, we used to have large families on farms. In fact, where I'm from, I had 2 high school classmates. One came from a family of 16. One came from a family of 12. And a lot of dairy operations in the Midwest, they had 12 kids because that was their labor source. We don't have that anymore. And there's a reason a lot of people have left the farm. And so over time, we've seen is a lot more hired farm workers. And then, but as you see the whole thing, we have just a lot less labor in total, irregardless if it's self-employed or hired labor. And so because of that, we have to get to the point of how do we replace labor? And we can pay more, but the reality is agriculture from a competitive wage, not from a minimum wage, but from competitive wage, really has a tough time putting up with McDonald's, with Walmart, and they're a lot easier jobs. And so because of that, even around here, there are operations that are offering $20 an hour minimum wage, farming and they can't hire anybody because they know that people can get that same wage at Walmart, or they can go to the mills and they can actually have a less stressful job and actually make the same wage. And so it's that competitive wage becomes a really big deal. And so how we're really getting at it is technology. And robotics is definitely moving into the realm of agriculture. And there's some really cool stuff in agriculture. But again, it gets back to how do we help the current generations actually make that transition into that digital market space, and how do we actually start incorporating some of those things? We've lost a lot of farms over time. Farms are getting a lot larger. We're losing smaller farms. And the reason I'm focusing on small and medium size is I honestly believe it gives us the flexibility in our food and ag production, is that middle area. We do need the large farms because we're in this country, we're feeding 360 million people. And we're feeding a lot of people globally as well. And so we still need the large operations, but we also need the small and the medium size because it's what gives us all that flexibility, especially for regional food systems. And so, but we're losing them. That's the part of ag is being gutted out. And unfortunately, they're really small. The operations that are 10 acres, 15 acres, they're not going to pay $30,000 an acre. They're not going to pay $10,000 an acre. And so because of that, as this smaller size, these get dropped out. You can tell we have a lot of small farms, but they only make up 17% of the actual production. If we look at the large-scale farms, and these are all based on economic numbers, they represent a small number of total farms, but almost 50% of the total production is coming off those larger farms. And so because of that, when we start looking at these sizes to help them, we need to find ways to actually reduce their costs so they can be more competitive in utilizing those expenses. Oops. Nope. I want to go that way. All right. The last real quick thing here on the expense aspect is if you look at income and on the small, and by the way, you can't see this, but that's a negative bar, which basically that first bar is income from farming. So small operations are losing money on the farm. And essentially what they're doing is it's off-farm income that's paying all the bills. All right. Medium size, they're doing a little bit better job. And in this case, you're looking at about 70,000, 75,000, somewhere in there. Actually, medium here is 80,000. So actually, these are closer to 120,000. But that is for one farm. So if you have a family of 4, now you're using all that cross-headed across all 4 or all 5. Okay. So the problem is they're still very dependent on this off-farm income to help them out, especially on benefits, insurance, any of those type of programs. So we need to be able to capture some of those dollars. Okay, so I'll speed up here. Couple quick things. So challenges to ag entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship, and I tell my students, everyone gets really fascinated about the term entrepreneurship. And they think about Jeff Bezos, and they think about Elon Musk, and they do that. It's like, look at all the money they make. It's like, yeah, get in agriculture, and you find out those things come to halt pretty quick. Agriculture is a very different realm. You've hopefully kind of already seen it. When we start looking at the challenges to entrepreneurship in agriculture is one, it's dependent on natural resources. Need to have access to natural resources. The other thing is, as we start seeing climate patterns change, that's going to change our availability to resources. Policies change those access to resources. Seasonality and time sensitivity. Most people, I think, in this room probably like beer. If we're harvesting hops, does anyone know when we harvest hops for the whole year? Yep, and when it starts, they can't stop. So it's 24 hours a day harvest, and it's roughly a 4 to 5 week window, and that's it. And so there's no time delay. If there's anything that actually shorts them out, you actually see hop production drop. And so there's nothing like, well, let's wait till October. We can do that with certain grains. We can push it off, but there's a lot of crops, especially vegetables, fruits, those type of things. They're very seasonal. So how do we make those things work? They're time sensitive, marketplace volatility, especially on the global standpoint. When Russia invaded Ukraine, what a lot of people don't realize is that threw the ag markets into so much turmoil. Ukraine was the number one producers of sunflower, and sunflower oil was the number one cooking oil on the world market. And that just sucked it right off the global market. So then suddenly you have all of this volatility. So if suddenly you're doing all this entrepreneurship work for a crop, and you go through these markets, suddenly it may not become cost effective anymore to continue the development of some of those functions. So market price volatility, perishability of products. There's a big difference between fresh products and preserved products. And for the most part, the only way we can actually preserve products is we got to control the water. So if we don't control water, we got to get to the marketplace within usually about 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks before it goes bad. Or we have to dry it, or we have to freeze it. And so all of those things is adds to that perishability. So a big chunk of agriculture is perishability. If I'm a software developer, do I have to worry about perishability? No, not really. I mean, there's a timeline. There may be some other things, but the reality is when we start looking at some of these things, we don't have 10 years to make that development. It has to be quick and has to come into place. There are labor and skill requirements that are very different in agriculture than we see in a lot of other fields. Regulatory and policy influence. Folks, for the most part, we're dealing with food. And once you start dealing with food, then you're dealing with Food and Drug Administration, you're dealing with USDA, you're dealing with a lot of things to make sure that we're not poisoning the public. And so that puts on a whole different layer of regulations, especially in animal agriculture. In animal agriculture, any technology we use for animals, we have to be able to account for. So if I use any type of RFID tag in their ear, I only put it in their ear, because if I put it anywhere on the body, I may not guarantee I can pull it out of the food supply. So it can only be in the ear, because that's the only part that is removed during processing that they know they can capture. And that is a food quality. That's a regulatory issue. So there's a lot of really cool technologies, but there's also limitations on how we can use some of these. And then the capital investment and finances. There's just a lot more capital investment that goes along with that. And of course, entrepreneurs, and especially those investors, they want a return on their investment. And in non-ag entrepreneurship, anyone know what the average return on investment that they like to see? And it will vary, but on average, roughly about 18 months. They want to see 18 months, 2 years return. For agriculture, it's 8 to 10 years. That's the average return. And so there's a lot of people going, I'm not going to put out a couple $1 million in my returns 10 years down the line. It's harder to invest. And the other thing is, I always tell people, agriculture, yes, we need to know the business, but it's a biological system. So you have to understand the biology. So if you're talking about on the animal ag, animal health, animal nutrition, reproductive systems, breeding, selection and genetics, all of those things are part of the biological process. On the cropping side, the same thing. We have to worry about what's in the soil. Fertilizer. Plants still need nutrients. We got to get that fertilizer to them somehow. Pest management. In fact, I'll give you a really quick example on pest management. Actually, I'm going to come back to that one. Pest management, there was a company that just went belly up, just went bankrupt November 1st. Largest vertical indoor farming operation in the United States, valued at $2.3 billion. Closed their doors November 1st because in all of their infinite wisdom, and they were a couple tech folks from Silicon Valley, got all this money. In all their wisdom, they forgot about one thing, pest management. And they actually got a microorganism into their water system that they could not get out, and it literally killed everything in all three of their individual greenhouses, and they ended up closing the door, and they put about 700 people out of a job, and just like that. And so even though they have all this cool technology, the biology is still pretty important. All right, so that has to be a part of all of these discussions. The other thing in agriculture is, in a business standpoint, we like talking about the operation cycle. What's that cash cycle? When do we need a cash infusion? How long can we hold that cash over? And a lot of times people are talking about on an annual basis. If we're in agriculture, we don't typically think things on an annual basis. In fact, if I make a selection on a beef animal and I want to include genetics and I want to see that come through, the average time to actually get that to that first generation is about 6 years when you get through it all. And so there's a tremendous amount of investment, and it takes a long time to process that through. So what's that production cycle? And most of the time, it's more than 12 months. The other thing I always tell people with agriculture and entrepreneurship is we love talking about sustainability. It's a great buzzword. I always tell people is the unfortunate thing is no one has truly defined what sustainability is. There are true definitions to sustainability. But the thing is, sustainability tend to be long-term. The banker still wants their payment every year or every quarter. And so because of that, you also have to worry about the short term. So I tell people in agriculture, we worry about optimization. How do we maximize or optimize the use of those resources short term to cover all those costs, but at the same time, we don't sacrifice the long-term improvements. And so in agriculture, what the biggest thing is we're trying to hit this middle area. How can we make sure that we're optimizing for the short term to be profitable so we can continue to invest long term without compromising the long-term type system? So this was the Bowery, which is, they actually had greenhouses in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia. And all of them were actually touted as this is the new and improved way that we're going to farm into the future. And again, valued at $2.3 billion, and within 6 months they shut the doors. So a lot of money gone. So if someone wants a lot of warehouse space, they have greenhouses that are available type of deal. Okay, so kind of go through this last little bit here. So when we talk about digital literacy, to helping those folks make that advancement, how do we help them small and medium size and add some of that flexibility? It's great to have all this technology, but it gets back to there's a lot of folks like, I have no idea how to even use it. I don't even know what data I should be collecting. So it's one thing to sit there and look at all the new cool gadgets, but it's another thing to sit there and say, will that gadget even help me? Will that software even help me? And so part of this is what we call digital literacy, and it's the ability to access, manage, understand, integrate, communicate, evaluate that information. And there's a lot of operations that I've talked to that are really interested in technology, but they're like, I have no idea how to use it. And once I get that information, how do I analyze it? How do I actually start sifting it out? And so all of those become really important. And because of that, we part of the research is now starting to look at what are those barriers to adoption, and then how do we use digital literacy, develop education, digital literacy to help them address that value proposition to see if they can actually incorporate it. But until they understand how to do it and what's all involved, it's going to be really difficult for them to even think about the incorporation of those things. I'm going to actually skip this just at an aspect of time. I will tell you this much. One of the things about digital literacy is we have an awful lot of folks in agriculture that are older than us. But I will also tell you this much. I actually know a rancher out of Milton Freewater, 75 years old. He actually looks at his cow. He actually tracks his cows with a drone because he's like, I'm tired of getting on a horseback. I'm tired of falling off. He says, I brake too easy. So he was like, I'm just going to try one of these drones. And he's like in love with it. And someone told me they saw him one time. He was sitting in the back of his pickup with a chair and a beer and out finding his cows. And he's like, this works. And so age doesn't mean that they're not going to accept it, but it's usually tends to be a barrier that we see. And in agriculture, for those operations, this aspect, which are full ownership, they're fairly old, and there's a lot of turnover that's happening with that. So as a new generation comes in, there are some barriers, family barriers, that actually kind of limit the incorporation of some of this technology as well. So that digital literacy really needs to not just be, how do we focus on college kids, but how do we focus on the 40-year-olds, the 50-year-olds, the 60-year-olds, the 70-year-olds, and how do we help them bridge those gaps? All right, just real quick, some opportunities in ag. I've further developed this graph out of one I got out of Colorado State. If you look at agriculture, agriculture is not just here's a farm and then here's someone eating the food. There's an awful lot of things in between. In fact, I always tell people they love using the farm to table, and what most people don't understand is the two that's in between. And there's a lot that happens in between that aspect, and especially if we're talking about fresh market versus preserved, processed, any of those type of things. What I also tell people is all of this creates a lot of opportunities to become more efficient, to actually change up some of the supply chains and actually make some robustness. And that's where the small, medium-sized operations really come into play, is they can fill those gaps. So there's some great opportunities, but they may not be that traditional format that we've seen in the past. Here's the other big thing, and this is when we start looking at the adoption of technologies, and they've looked at it in Europe. Netherlands is the #1 country for adoption of technology. In fact, they actually produce as much green material, food, all those type of products in their space of land as California does, and they do it in the size of Rhode Island. And they do it for California and even Texas, that much. And it's because they base it on a lot of vertical farming that's happening. And so there's a lot of intensive, but even they have found the similar deal, is why don't some people adopt certain technologies? And it gets back to that risk reward. They want to know, what is the value? If I'm going to put up the risk, am I going to really get, what's my benefit going to come out of it? Smaller operations, we tend to see, have a much higher level of unacceptable risk. They just don't have the resource. Something that doesn't work could actually completely wipe them out. Where if you're an operation where you're a Simplot, you're an RD Offit, you're a Church of Latter-day Saints, okay, I lost $1 million. That's okay. It sucks, but we can absorb it. Small operations can't do that. All right, so they have a lot more resources, and so what we need to figure out, especially from the digital literacy standpoint, is what is that risk-reward ratio? And so at this level, what is their acceptable level of risk in incorporating some of that technology? And in order for us to help them make that incorporation, we also need to help them identify what's the value that they're going to get out of it. Are they going to see a 10% improvement in crop production? Are they going to see actually maybe a 15% drop in their fertilizer costs because now they're more precise in the types of fertilizer that they're putting out? So that becomes the difficulty. There's not a one-size-fits-all, essentially, that we see. Food waste, I'm going to kind of go through a couple of these here real quick. These are all big areas. If we look at waste within the whole food system, there's a lot of areas where we can capture, which all of these create opportunities. So this is everything from pre-harvest, so putting the plants in the ground, getting those calves on the ground, those type of things, to harvest, and then everything all the way up to the point where it shows up at the consumer side of things. So there's a lot of opportunities. Food waste, and by the way, food loss is different than food waste. Just real quick, food loss is just we've lost poundage, we've lost units. It can be edible and non-edible, all right? Food waste is loss of edible food. And so that's typically from the consumers or food service up. That's usually where we see the biggest level of food waste. But food loss in general is if we're seeing things like, honestly, I've gone down the road and I've seen tailgates open on back of trucks and you're dropping grain out and those things, that's a food loss. Those are products going on. When I see peppers laying on the side of the interstate, that's a food loss, especially when a green pepper is $1.68 a pepper. It's like, I had to stop and pick those up, but they're kind of bruised, but oh well. Anyway, the other thing is, as we start looking at the technologies, and size of operation. This yield monitors, we started looking at GPS systems. GPS systems have been out now for quite a while. Agriculture's been using them for a long time. My oldest brother actually got into the field in 1989 and with some of the first companies out in Nebraska. So GPS has been around in agriculture for a long time. And we're finding better ways. And it's one of those where a lot of people have adopted them because another thing is you can retrofit equipment. You don't need to necessarily buy a new tractor, new combine. You can retrofit. So it makes it easier to put into the system. Guidance auto steering, which has been really nice, though you tend to fall asleep because especially if you have big field and you're not steering, doing something, you tend to nod off. Variable rate technology. This stands for if I have fertilizer, so if I'm fertilizing soil, it's NPK, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And the soil requires different rates of those. So if I have a fertilizer system that's actually going out and based on soil mapping, it will regulate the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that drops at different points in the field. So that's what they're talking about with variable rate. So it changes those things up. And we have people in this valley that use that quite often. Drones is really taking off. We're seeing a lot of drone technology, especially for spraying. We're seeing a lot of drone technology. Robotic milking. This is one, actually this is a really cool one, is a robotic milking because a lot of dairies anymore, they can't find any labor. So they're going to robotics. And they're completely buying into it to the point where they're now having cattle being fed by robots. Milked by robots. In fact, Jason Chamberlain, who's outside of Vail, Jason and Marie, for them to go back to the farm, they had to invest in robots. Now they milk 700 Jersey cows, and Jason has to force himself to go out and visit the cows because the cows milk themselves. And he gets the pings on his phone, and if they got, it'll identify if they're getting sick, do they need to go into a different pen, all those type of things. They feed push up. They no longer do it manually. They have basically, it looks like a giant Roomba that discharges around the barn and just goes around the barn 24 hours a day, keeps pushing up feed. They've seen health improved by over 30%. So mastitis, infection of the udder, has gone down by 30%. And they actually see, I think they've seen a 25% boost in milk production per cow because of that, because less stress. But there's a huge investment that goes into those things. So we're seeing a lot more of those things come into play. I'll give you a couple. These are a couple little quick deals. This is actually a laser weeder. So we're seeing high energy weeding systems. So this was one, and if it sucks, it's because I took the video. This is over by Boardman. This is a field of organic onions. And as you watch it, you'll kind of see some here. So what the system is doing is actually covering the field. It is mapping it. It is sending that information into artificial intelligence. It is identifying the weeds from the plants, and then it's firing lasers at it to actually destroy the weed. And so that kind of gives you an idea. The bad thing is it moves at 0.7 miles per hour. And they had to put a tractor on the front end of this because they do have autonomous, but they get stuck. And so they put them on a tractor because they can pull a tractor out. The problem with that is the drivers will fall asleep. So they've already burned how many fields because they'll fall asleep and they'll just keep going and they'll be in a pasture and be firing lasers and it'll cause a fire. So they're working on a better system there. So this is a closer view of it. And as you get close, you can kind of see the little poofs of smoke. I try to get close. You can see my bald head there. You can see these little lights kind of. So that's actually lasers that are firing. And it's actually, if you go up to see the weed, it actually goes right through the center of the weed. And in this case, it's watercress. It's not perfect, but basically each one of those units are $1.7 million. They have 7 of them. And they will pay them off in 3 years because the cost of labor to weed organic onions is so high, and they're only about 55% efficient, that they can pay for these off in 3 years. So that's what we're going to on those type of things. This is an autonomous greenhouse. Actually, I took my students. So these are my students. I took them over there this spring. This is actually Canopy. They're actually out of just outside of Jervis, Oregon. So they're a completely autonomous greenhouse, and which means we're in there, but essentially what they have is they have a system over here that actually all they got to do is fill it with trays and then walk away. And then it's completely robotic. The trays will actually plant all the sprigs. This actually goes up and around. There's a little aspect here. It's just kind of hard to see. It actually fills the water. It actually monitors water. And as it comes back around, it'll determine if they need more water, less water, how much nutrients. When they're ready to harvest, there's a little system over here. It actually pulls the plug out. It's a robotic arm, pulls the plug out, puts it in a tray, sends it out to the other end. They're still working on the packaging side, but at the very end, essentially, you can buy an autonomous greenhouse for $1 million, and the only thing you have to do is just keep putting in the trays and taking away the packaged product at the end. And they're looking at this for in urban centers. So if you got a neighborhood that's a food desert, they can start using these. So this is some of that technology that's going into play. From a practical standpoint, virtual fencing has now really started to take off. We're in an area that things burn a lot. If you've ever been around livestock, especially cattle, they require fencing. Right now, the going rate is, if you want it done in the next year, it costs you roughly $20,000 per mile to put in a fence. If you want it done in the next 6 months, it's $30,000. That's what I've been told. So all this ground that burns and you got to put in ground, there's a lot of money going in. So they're going with virtual fencing, and there's operations in California and Washington that are now going on this because they're like, we can't invest in the fences. So the pain point was we can't invest, and now what we're doing is we're actually seeing a lot more cows with collars like this. And essentially what we do is we develop a perimeter, and then those cows, and it doesn't take that long for them to actually get trained, they will actually stay in that area without a fence. Now, some of them may wander out, but for the most part, they'll come back in, type of deal. They are using this. The federal government is now investing in this for managing rangeland fires. So if they can create fire breaks, they can actually use cows, and they'll actually design fire breaks virtually and actually start putting out cows. So it's interesting how it's happening. The really cool thing is producers are actually the ones pushing this because they're like, we can't afford fencing. So it's a cost deal. Okay, I am pretty much out of time. So all of that builds into my research program moving forward is I got a grant out there for Western SARE, really trying to develop that aspect of what are those components that we need to be measuring on the ground? How do we help a producer identify those variables that they need to measure? How do we measure them? How do we capture that information, and how do we help them actually analyze it? And so that's where artificial intelligence can come into play is if I'm Brett Rudd and I'm here out of town, I don't have time to go sit on my computer, but if I can start using artificial intelligence and start using that to make those day-to-day decisions, suddenly now I'm saving time, because that's one of the bigger things that they're losing. They just don't have the time. And so because of that is defining that value of adoption. What is the pain point at which they will adopt that technology? And it will be different for all of them. The degree of production and capacity limitations to change that adoption behavior, because that's what all this is changing behavior. So what are the things, what are the capacities they need? Can they retrofit it? Do they have to buy new equipment? The bad thing about a lot of new equipment is, especially if it contains software, it has to be updated. And if you're John Deere, you may sit there and say, we'll charge you $10,000 a year to update your software. And if you don't update it, your tractor will no longer work. Well, you're kind of forced to do that. So things get pretty expensive. And then determine that acceptable risk-reward ratio by operational size and type. So what are those things that will actually help them? What can we do to develop that digital literacy, which is that second part, to actually help them through that pain point, or what is that risk-reward to get them to start thinking about that adoption? And then that education component will be helping them with understanding that risk-reward. So if they understand how it utilized, then they have a much better chance of being able to evaluate what is the reward back to me and whether or not I want to accept or install that technology as I move forward. So I have went 5 minutes over time. So unfortunately, kickoff has already happened. So my apologies for that. So questions? And I know that was a really lot of information in a very short period of time.
But we still have about 5 minutes for questions. So,
Thank you. This was really interesting. I'm not in this field, so I'm newly educated. I'm curious about your research. What's your timeline, and what do you see as the product of the research, and who's your audience?
So we will actually be starting on the aspect. So the first part is really survey, and we're going to focus on producers, small and medium-sized producers, really in Eastern Oregon. So working with Oregon Farm Bureau, Oregon Cattlemen's. So our audience is going to be that Eastern Oregon. That's kind of where our start point is. We will start that this spring with getting those surveys. So I will start developing that actual survey itself, and we'll break that out to where we understand the demographics, but also identify all those individual barriers, and so code them properly so we can analyze that data. And so the idea is we will get that out there this spring, so that way this summer we have that information, and I can start putting all that information, start compiling it, start look at things like risk reward. And part of that survey will also be the economics. So understanding what is some of their cost of production, what are their expenses, so we can actually start looking at that risk reward ratio for them. And so the idea is by the end of summer, we have that, at least that first round of all that information together, so we can actually then start working with, okay, how can we start developing that digital literacy to help address those pain points that individuals may have. And so, try and get a couple of publications out just from that survey data, get that information out there. And then from that point, that provides us that foundation for going after some other grants on developing the educational component. And then the educational component will be, regional operations, agriculture operations, but our hope is, and also putting on a regional conference that's looking at how do we incorporate, how do we bring people from across the country, or at least from the Northwest, to here to actually talk about those technologies and how to utilize them and bring in that expertise. So, yeah.
So you mentioned Norway, Netherlands
Netherlands.
as being the highest. So as these technologies increase the capacity for production, you increase the capacity for production, the price or the value per piece of grain goes down, right? So the small and medium-sized operations are going to just see less returns by producing more.
Right.
Have they figured out how to make small and medium-sized operations sustainable, in other words, that family farm, through increased technology, or has it just fed the larger and extremely large operations that might exist there?
Yes. It's done a little bit. It's done a little bit of both. So there's been that aspect of some of those traditional smaller family farms have gone by the wayside, or they've had to focus on some like real high quality, maybe it's artisan type products, something that from a marketing standpoint, they can make stand out from a commodity. The other aspect is filling in the gaps. So if you look at the entire supply chain, then there's these areas where a larger operation is just like, that's not worth our time and inputs to fill that gap. And the smaller and medium size are looking at it as that's our opportunity to fill that. So that's why I said you're kind of seeing a little bit of everything, but essentially a lot of those small and medium size, they're having to change what they're doing. And instead of, they can't compete with the larger ones. And so unless they have a marketing advantage, which a lot of them try to focus on, or try to fill in those gaps in the supply chain that the larger operations don't want to worry about. So, and we're seeing that in a lot of other countries too that are trying to get into it as well. So,
Maybe time for one more question.
So are you also seeing a job market come out of helping people adapt the technology? Like, is there like representatives who go out and help them install this technology and learn how to use it?
Yes. So one of the things, this is where Steve and I had a discussion, is I've had farming operations come to me and say, okay, we have, so some of the newest John Deere tractors are basically the person is only in the cab to drive it down the road. That's it. And so essentially they take that tractor to the field. They're going up to it with an iPad or some sort of tablet. They're plugged in there. The field location, so all those maps are already downloaded into the system. What type of tillage equipment it's pulling, so they know the horsepower to be able to precisely tool the power unit, and the, seeding rates, all those type of things. Plug it in and then just hit and go. And then the tractor takes care of itself, and it does everything else, and the equipment's autonomous, and it's doing it. But what they come back and said is, we need people who can come out who actually know how to speak a little bit of ag, because our farm managers are like, we're seeing this, and they're like, well, that's not what we see on our computer. They're like, yeah. So there's the biggest thing is there's that disconnect in background, and so then it's creating some issues there. And so they've told me, one company, Agri Northwest, told me, they says, if you have anyone who wants to come out and they have a little bit of IT or anything like that, we'll pay them $150,000, $180,000 right off the bat. And I'm like, will you take old faculty members who may not have? So yeah, that's the other thing is we've also seen, so Three Mile Canyon Farms, they have an irrigation system. So they run about 365 center pivots. And so they have a room that's about a quarter of the size of this room, and they can run the entire farm off these screens, touch screens and all that. And so, but one of the things they found out was they pay $2 million a year for cybersecurity training. And Greg Harris, the head, is like, why am I spending $2 million a year? And then they looked at the deal, and they're actually getting pinged over 100,000 times a month with people trying to hack into their system. So as all these technologies are coming in, so now there's more in this regards to cybersecurity on ag systems. So part of that safety component that I didn't touch on is how do we keep the information secure? Blockchain, if anyone's ever heard of blockchain, blockchain is one of those that crypto coins are pretty much around blockchain. Well, blockchain is one of those they see for verification of food as well, because it can't be altered. So we can actually use blockchain all the way through. The problem is we don't know who owns the data. So people are like, we're not using it because who owns the data? And especially if you're going to international, who owns the data? So there's a lot of other new fields that are coming into play because of this.
I think most people are trying to hack the laser weeder, because that would be
so. I think so too.
All right. Well, let's thank our speaker again.